Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mountainside Podcast. Our guest for this episode is Orion Aon from Forage, Colorado. I really enjoyed sitting down and learning a ton about foraging, mushroom hunting. This was super informational and fun for me to learn during this episode. I hope you enjoy our conversation. What's up, Orion? Thanks for coming up. Super excited to have you today. For our listeners that are just tuning into this, we are going to talk to Orion today about foraging. And in Colorado, we're really all over the place, right? Mm-hmm. But Orion has a company called Forage, Colorado, and he's been nice enough to take some time out of his schedule today and come in and help educate me, which I'm super excited about, which is in turn going to educate our listeners too. So
yeah, hopefully.
Yeah. So we brought you in to educate us on harvesting, native plants, mm-hmm. roots, berries, mushrooms. You just kind of do it all.
Yeah. I would say my specialty is mushrooms, just because that's what I'm most passionate about. But I really, enjoy all of it, and other wild foods as well, fishing, hunting, that sort of stuff. So.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm a big hunter too. I get out. I guess I'm an elk hunter mostly. Deer a little bit, but love to archery hunt.
Yeah. Love
to get my own food that way. I'm not really your typical trophy hunter, right?
Yeah.
I'm pretty much out there to get food.
The meat.
Yep. And then fish. I do a lot of catch and release, just because I guess I'm not that I wouldn't eat fish, but I just don't eat trout a whole lot. I prefer like a salmon, wild salmon, or a pike or something like that. But if you catch me in the backcountry and there's some brookies or cutthroat and a good campfire and a hike in, then
the exact same.
Tastes amazing, right?
I'm the exact same. Yeah. I do a lot of fly fishing, but I grew up going to Minnesota every summer.
Okay.
And so that's sort of where I got a lot of my fishing start. And so that's like bass and walleye and bluegill and perch and all that sort of stuff. So
yeah, man, those are all great tasting fish too. So can you tell us or tell our listeners a little bit about Forage, Colorado, and what type of things that you're teaching? You have classes that you offer to help educate people on how to identify plants, mushrooms, berries, all kinds of different stuff. But.
Yeah. The classes are at a limited capacity now, just because, what my time's pretty limited for those, but I do try to offer them. Forage, Colorado was sort of just like a passion project that I started in 2015. I started my foraging career when I was 10. My dad took my brother and I out with one of his friends on a mushroom hunt, and that was sort of like my beginning in this weird like treasure hunting in the woods thing, looking for mushrooms. I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, so we did it in the mountains of New Mexico.
Very similar to Colorado, though.
Yeah, very similar.
That's an awesome country, man.
It's really cool down there, and so that was sort of what started it. And every year we would mushroom hunt, and then towards the end of my college career, I got interested in it again and started doing more mushrooming and then learning about general foraging. And then in 2015, I started Forage, Colorado, to sort of share my interest and what I was learning with other people who were interested. And then eventually, within a year, I would say, that sort of became an outlet for me to educate others instead of just like a community. And so it sort of just developed into that. And I had a lot of interest in people wanting to learn more about it, asking questions and wanting to take classes. And so I started offering those. I still work full-time at the Colorado State Forest Service as the field production manager, growing. Oh,
awesome. I didn't know that.
Yeah, growing seedling trees. So that's my full-time job. And then I do this Forage, Colorado stuff when I have time, and sort of as like a passion hobby project business. So.
Wow, that's awesome. So you spend a lot of time outdoors between hunting, fishing, harvesting, right?
Yeah, I try to. Yeah.
Yeah. What kind of things are you, just for our listeners, because I've done my homework and I've known about you for a little while, and I actually got to give a shout out to my friend Carla, is the one that introduced me to your website and your Instagram page.
Thank you, Carla.
Yeah. And she was like, you got to check this guy out. He'd be perfect for the podcast. So we were able to get a hold of you. But tell our listeners, what all you harvest. I mean, you go after mushrooms, berries. We've kind of dropped all that stuff. But what are some things right now in the winter months that you can go after? Is it only a spring thing? Like, I got so many questions for you.
Cool.
And I'm going to try not to ask multiples at once. I'm really bad at that. But
I'm usually pretty good at being able to store them and get to all of them. But we can always re-ask if we need to.
Sure.
So winter in Colorado is not great for foraging. So, I kind of take like a break from this year. I took a break from like social media in general for like a month and a half during hunting season and foraging stuff, and just was like, mental break and focus on hunting. But in other places, there's good winter forage. If you're like in coastal Pacific Northwest, that's some of the best mushrooming. Places where there's a little bit of a warmer climate. There's
a little bit more humidity.
Yeah, there's decent winter foraging. Here there isn't much. There's a few, like you'll see people talking about digging up like medicinal roots, maybe some like tree bark type stuff, but it's not like that really interesting, like mushrooms and fruits that's like sort of the megafauna, quote unquote, of the foraging world. Like
they're kind of the crown
mushrooms
jewels.
Are exciting, right? Berries and those sorts of things are exciting. They get people excited. Whereas you're like, I went out and foraged some bark to make tea. Some people are interested in it, but it's not, as exciting. And it's not as exciting for me to sort of do,
Sure.
I enjoy the warm month foraging and when there's abundance. So, as far as what I go after, it sort of is seasonal, and I'm always learning more. This is one of those hobbies, and like many, where you can just like continue learning, like year after year. There's always
it never really ends with mushrooms, right? Because they're still finding different species of mushrooms that you can't identify, right?
Mycology is a very, very novel field of study. We know, I forget the exact figures, but a large majority of fungal species don't even fruit with a mushroom. They're underground or in a substrate and never fruit an actual mushroom or a fruiting body, a fungal body. They stay as the mycelium and, unseen to us unless we get in there and explore with microscopes.
And I kind of know a little bit because I've been doing my homework and this really interests me, but can you explain to our listeners what mycelium is?
Yeah.
It's kind of the neurosystem to fungus or mushrooms, right? That's underground, and they've made some crazy discoveries that it's all kind of interconnected, right?
Yeah, and we're still learning more, regularly. But essentially, an easy way to describe it to someone who doesn't know anything would be like the roots of the fungal body. That's not exactly correct because, that's the actual fungal body and the mushroom is the fruit. Whereas, with like a tree, the root and the shoot are sort of codependent, and then those then fruit. So it's a little bit different, but it's kind of a good way to get it in your mind of the shape of the mycelium and sort of how its function is. It runs through the soil, literally everywhere unless it's been destroyed by something. And many species have a relationship with the plants and trees around them, and those are called the mycorrhizal relationships. And what that means is they attach to the plants and trees' roots and provide greater surface area so that those plants can uptake more nutrients. And in turn, the fungus receives sugars and energy from the tree. So it's sort of a mutualistic
And they're really kind of the decomposing body of the forest, right? Like, when something dies, obviously you have flies and insects and stuff that fill some of that void and make things happen pretty rapidly. But then what's left? It's actually kind of the fungus that takes over, right? And a lot of times if like a tree falls on the ground or a branch or something, a lot of times you're finding mushrooms underneath those, right? Because they're basically breaking that down.
Yeah, so those are going to be the saprophytic mushrooms, so those decomposers. The mycorrhizal ones are the ones that make associations with plants and trees, and the saprophytic are the ones that do all the decomposing. And, there's some crossing and stuff in there, but that's kind of a rudimentary way to explain it. And if we didn't have these, nothing would decompose, stuff would be laying around, we would just get overrun with waste, essentially, natural waste, and it wouldn't become recycle into the system. So
yeah, and even to the point, like when you leave those strawberries in the refrigerator for too long, right? When they start getting that black type of mold on it, that's actually a fungus, right?
It is, yeah. Molds are a fungus. Yep.
Okay.
They're a little different, to the ones that I'm picking and eating, but they are related.
Yeah, you don't want to eat some of them, right?
Yeah. Well, some of them are, like blue cheese is a fungus, so
yeah,
fermentation, all that sort of stuff. Some of those are aided by fungus. So.
How many different types of mushrooms are out there that we know of? Do you kind of know the answers to that? And how many species are in Colorado that translate across the world or the U.S.? I mean, is it different species by different regions? And
yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head in terms of species that we know of. And like I mentioned, we're always learning about more. Many that don't ever fruit, so we never see their identifiable, fruit because they're in the soil forever. There are as far as regionality goes, it's sort of an interesting thing to look at, and we're learning more about this too regularly. We have species that, or maybe I should say families and genera, would be the correct way to say that, that we see all over the world. But in some regions, only certain species will occur. And we could get very into the weeds on like the taxonomy and
hey, I'm going to warn you right now. I'm not a very smart guy. I'm a dumb guy that likes to learn interesting things, So.
Yeah. I'll keep it simple because
keep it simple for me.
I could talk about a lot of this stuff and get way into the weeds on it. But essentially, let's just take the Rocky Mountain king bolete. That mushroom is one of the most hunted in Colorado. It's also called the porcini. And it's in a group of mushrooms that are generally referred to as porcini or the Boletus edulis group. And in North America, there are 15 species that sort of fall into that group of mushrooms that are like Boletus edulis, which is a European species. So we have species that are very similar to this European species, which is where we first, learned about much of our taxonomy.
Because that's a big part of their culture there, isn't it?
And everything that we know, we're sort of, the Europeans came to North America and settled. So our information sort of started with what they knew. So we're always learning more. Our local species, Boletus rubriceps, was identified and renamed in 2014.
Wow, so that's pretty recent.
Yeah, we just learned that it was a completely different species, and we're learning that sort of stuff, yearly, weekly, monthly. So that regionality question is sort of a complicated one because we are always learning more. And there's actually some really cool projects. I have like a connection with a lot of the mycology in Colorado just through, the foraging and the stuff that I do, and occasionally I'll help them with classes and stuff.
Yeah, that's great, man. That's one of the reasons why we invited you in too, because you're so connected with that, and I really feel like you're the best educated in the area too. So
well, there are some really knowledgeable people that have very specific knowledge, and some other people that have really broad knowledge. But I sort of like to dip into everything, and sort of just like collect as much as I can, and then re-spread it out. And I think
that's why we reached out to you too, because on top of hunting mushrooms, you're an elk hunter, fisherman, that sort of thing. It kind of encompasses
just
it all.
The wild foods is sort of, a passionate subject for me, just
Yeah.
in general. But as far as regionality, there are a couple projects that are studying our species of fungus in Colorado, and they have sort of like a crowdsource thing that they're trying to work into it. And if anyone's interested in this, you can look up the Colorado Mycoflora Project. I think it's been renamed now to the Fungal Diversity Project or something like that. I think it's Fundus.
Can you look that up for us, Anna? See if you can find it so we can just get that information correct.
Absolutely. Read me back that website one more time.
It was the Colorado Mycoflora Project, and I think it's been renamed to Fungal Diversity Project.
Okay.
But they're essentially asking for citizen scientists to submit samples, and they'll get DNA testing. DNA testing, the pricing for that has gone way down in recent years. And so people are submitting samples, and they're DNA testing them, and then matching them to species or naming new species out of them. So
Okay.
it's pretty interesting that, that's the old one. There it is.
Is that the one?
Yep.
There we go. Hey, we found it.
So can you read us that website, Anna, in case people want to learn some more about this?
So this is fundis.org. That's fundis.org.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You're so welcome.
And so, like I mentioned, they're wanting to get out and sort of map all of the species in Colorado and elsewhere, and essentially create a knowledge base and a database of the actual,
So is the concept there that you would find a species and maybe you could go to this website to help to identify what it is and figure out if it's edible? I mean, I know that there's some things you need to watch out for out there.
Yeah, we could talk about that too.
Yeah.
This is more so like the mycological side, like the studying of what
It's
we
the
have
science
here.
behind
Yeah,
it.
I mean, we have, I would guess, hundreds, if not thousands, of species that we don't actually know which species they are. It's just sort of like they fit into this European or this species that we know from somewhere else in North America. So that's the closest match. That's what we're going to call it, but it might not actually be that species.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. What, so can we talk about mycophobia a little bit?
Yeah.
And, I think that there's some misconceptions with mushrooms in the U.S. in general and just with history, especially when you start going down the psilocybin path, right?
Uh-huh.
And how that affects people and what happened in the 70s. And, I mean, there's all these rabbit holes that you can go down. I mean, tons of them.
Yeah.
But as far as mycophobia goes, that's the fear of mushrooms, right? Or being poisoned by mushrooms. And there are some poisonous strains out there, but can you dive into, how often do you run across those when you're foraging, and how common is it? And what are some of the best practices for you to not poison yourself, I guess?
Yeah. So I'm going to touch on that last point first.
Okay.
The easiest thing that anyone who wants to get into foraging can do is to not poison yourself, is to not eat anything until you are 100% certain of its identity. So that's the easiest thing. There is a single species that I know of in the world that can poison you from touching it. And it's a very rare species in, I believe, Asia and possibly Australia, called the fire coral.
There's trees in Australia, right, that
Yeah,
can kill you.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
So you can handle mushrooms, you can look at them, you can smell them, you can even taste them as long as you don't swallow what you're tasting, and they will not harm you. Once you ingest them is when you will get harmed by either plant or mushroom. There are plants, touching can harm, so specifically mushrooms. But the general rule for foraging is don't eat it unless you're 100% certain of its identity.
Okay. And what are the best ways to identify that? I'm sure that there's some books out there. I know you have some information on your website.
Yeah. So as far as resources, I have a resource list on my website that I sort of update, here and there. I have some more books that I need to add to it actually pretty soon. There's a lot of great online communities. Not everyone is a big fan of Facebook, but it does have some great foraging and mushrooming communities.
Don't bring your politics to the mushroom pages.
No,
forums.
Those don't typically go very well. I have a page there, Forage Colorado. That's where I started.
Okay.
I'm more active on Instagram, just because it's easier to sort of post something.
We are too. Honestly, our Instagram is set to go directly to Facebook.
Yeah, mine too.
We don't even check messages there. It's really bad. Like
I tune in, but
someday we will.
I tune into my Facebook and answer questions and stuff. But what I really do is during the peak months of mushrooming specifically, but also plant foraging, I get onto these groups and ask questions myself and help people identify stuff that I know. And so this sort of like repetitive nature of like, oh, this is a mushroom I know, let me help you identify it. It sort of locks it into my brain and it helps me learn too. And it's a good way to sort of, interact with like-minded people. So really, if you're wanting to get into it, check some of that stuff out. As far as plant foraging, the books that I always recommend first, and really someone who's become a bit of a mentor for me, is Samuel Thayer. He's an author. He has 3 books. He's in Wisconsin, but his books cover all of North America for plant foraging, and they're great.
Are mushrooms included in that? Or
there isn't any mushroom information
plants
there, just plants. Yep.
Okay, yeah, I want to go down the plant path with you, but I got one more question before we dive off of mushrooms.
Yeah, we'll talk about the toxic ones a little bit too, because I want to jump back to that.
Actually, go ahead if you want. Yeah.
So we sort of touched on it, that there are toxic mushrooms around. In Colorado, I believe the count is 4 or 5 deadly species, and 3 or 4 of them are. One of them is a little bit debated, and the others are pretty rare. Our most common deadly species is called the deadly Gallerina, and it's a little brown mushroom that grows from wood, and it's actually pretty common. I run into it. Like,
are you looking this up, Anna? I got to see this thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got to see this.
Okay.
I'm one of those
All right,
people
cool.
who's
Yeah.
afraid of eating the wrong mushroom.
Just look up deadly Gallerina. Gallerina.
Let's see this gorgeous thing.
So this is our most common deadly species in Colorado. Sort of nondescript brown mushroom that grows on wood.
It looks like your typical mushroom too, right?
It just looks like a mushroom.
Yeah, so this one's the most common, and this species is, the Gallerina group of mushrooms, just a few that are deadly, are, I believe, worldwide, and they're sort of what creates. There's a few other deadly small brown poisonous mushrooms, but they sort of create this rhetoric of just don't eat little brown mushrooms.
And they grow on top of wood specifically?
From decaying wood. And it doesn't
Okay.
need to be on top. It can be from the side, or,
Sure.
even buried decaying wood. You see, if you spend any time on mushroom pages, people talking about LBMs, which are little brown mushrooms. Not a term that I'm a huge fan of, but, so this would be our most common deadly species. And
how often do you run across these? Because, you spend a ton of time in the forest, and then with your hobbies.
I probably see these a few times a year.
Okay. So it's pretty common.
Yeah, and I know what to look for and where to look for them. But they can be pretty common. Our other deadly species are pretty rare. Some of the amanitas, which are, if anyone has done any research in mushrooms, you'll have heard of the deadly amanitas, the destroying angel and the death cap. Those are, we have documented both of them, but they're
pretty hardcore names.
They're pretty rare here. So those red ones are...
Oh, that's like the iconic poisonous mushroom.
Yeah, so those red ones are actually Amanita muscaria. Those are not deadly, and those ones get a bad rap. We could talk about those for a little while too, if you want.
My next question is about psilocybin and how often you get asked.
Okay.
Where can I find those?
Yeah. So this is a good lead into that, because this mushroom Amanita muscaria, or the fly agaric, gets a bad rap. It is probably the most iconic mushroom, right? The Mario mushroom. You see these red mushrooms with white dots. If someone wants to show a mushroom or a toadstool,
it's the emoji mushroom, right?
Yeah. That's what you see, right?
Yep.
And it has a huge history all over the world, and it gets a bad rap. People say it's deadly. You'll see articles online of people saying, "Don't eat this." I usually see 1 or 2 every year of people novice writers or journalists writing about people in the woods and mushrooming and foraging, and they always mention this one, and often it's incorrect. This mushroom is considered toxic if you eat it raw. It will give you stomach cramps, there's some other symptoms. It can make you hallucinate. So raw, it can cause some issues, but it's not deadly. Cooked can cause issues for some people. I wouldn't recommend just eating it straight up cooked, but you can process it by boiling with
like a tea or
boiling
something.
with 2 changes of water and then cooking, and it renders it safe to eat. I've never tried this. I have some friends who have and said it's actually really good. There are some stuff online if people are interested. I wouldn't suggest doing this.
Yeah. After you ingest it, after you've boiled it twice, are you still going to go down that Pink Floyd?
Nope. So it's
rabbit hole?
So
Okay.
we'll get to that in a sec.
Okay.
So the changing water, boiling removes the toxic compounds. So there's 2 compounds in this that we're kind of getting at. And I don't want to get too technical on it, but
Sure.
ibotenic acid and mucimol. And so those are the 2 compounds that make you sick and make you hallucinate. And they're not like, I always get them confused, but I believe it's ibotenic acid that will make you sick and the mucimol that makes you hallucinate. But I sometimes confuse those because I'm not super into that side of the foraging world. But essentially, boiling removes the one that can make you sick, and then you can render it safe to eat. You can also process it, and this was something that, shamans did and people did, sort of like a spiritual thing, and people do now sometimes recreationally. There's also people that use this mushroom as sort of like a pain treatment.
Okay.
And
they are using some psilocybin now too to help with like PTSD and cancer patients that are at a certain stage, right? To help not so much cure cancer, or it's more of being in a mental state and being okay with what's coming ahead, right? Yeah.
And so the connection between those, so the Amanita muscaria doesn't have psilocybin in it. It's mucimol, and it creates a different sort of hallucinogen than the psilocybin would. And like I said, I'm not huge into this. I don't have personal experience with any of it. This is just sort of from research. As far as the psilocybin goes, I've seen a ton of really good, clinical studies and stuff coming out recently, which is really good that, that's starting to help people and become possibly like
so specifically those type of treatments are done with psilocybin and not with, sorry, what was the last one that you just
the fly agaric. Yeah.
Okay. Fly agaric.
Yeah. It's a different compound entirely that causes that sort of the high, if you will.
Okay.
But as far as foraging for psilocybin, we have a few species that have it in Colorado, but they're pretty rare. So it's not really a thing that you can just like go out in the wild and find commonly here.
And, I know it's just recently been decriminalized, but when does it become a narcotic? As soon as you pick it? Or do you know what
I think there's some gray lines
I'm sure
in there.
you're not a lawyer, can speak on the laws.
I don't actually know. I think that if you happen to find some in the wild, pick them, and were stopped for whatever reason, I think that would become illegal. Okay. If they tested them and that sort of thing. And that can feed back into the mycophobia thing, because oftentimes if you were to get caught with these substances, the person pulling you over may not, or inspecting you may not know what it is. I've heard instances of mycologists heading to like a convention with samples and being stopped and harassed, even though they don't have like actual psilocybin or any active compounds. They
just got a bunch of different mushrooms with them.
Study samples, and they've been harassed for them. So
wow, that's messed up, man.
It's part of the mycophobia thing, and it's actually starting to change a little bit in North America. I've seen some change in recent years, but I don't know.
There's some great documentaries and information out there too right now where I kind of learned, and I'm just getting into it, but there's a ton of information out there if you want to learn about this.
Yeah, I don't know that we'll ever become like Eastern Europeans where they're like culturally, like grandpa does it, dad does it, I do it, my kids are going to do it. They go out on like, that's their weekend is like, as a family, they go out and pick mushrooms, and I don't know that we'll ever get to there. There are some people that do that, often people from those places, but it's definitely becoming more popular, and there's more of an interest in it. So
sure. And now, what So you can't forage in the winter months. Do you grow any of your own mushrooms or anything at home? I mean, do you, or plants during these winter months?
I don't really. I have done a little bit of cultivation experience in the past. I have some friends that do it, so I'm sure I could bum some mushrooms off of them if I needed to.
Right.
If I get a hankering. But typically I have enough dehydrated that I can sort of, use those throughout the winter until I can recollect and save more. But yeah, I kind of use the winter as just my time off from that world. I'll still post stuff, and I'll do other projects. Like right now we're working on a choke cherry wine.
I think I saw that. So you're actually fermenting it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. She's got into winemaking recently, and I harvested a bunch of choke cherries with the plan of doing some of that. So
nice.
We're working on that right now, and I'll do fermentations and stuff that I can do in the winter months with stuff that I've saved. A lot of cooking and those sorts of things, but I don't really do much foraging while I'm out in the winter.
And then before we dive off of mushrooms, can you speak on? I know there's been a bunch of research done. They're using it for like natural pesticides now on a lot of plants or farm-based plants. I don't think it's in mass crops just yet, but they're definitely doing research on it.
Yeah, I don't know a ton about that. I do know a little bit and have talked to some people. There's one woman down in the Palisade area that's studying a rust, which is a disease that attacks weeds, and one specifically that attacks Canada thistle. That is of interest to me for my job because I deal with a lot of Canada thistle while growing trees.
Is that with the big purple bulb on
the smaller
top?
ones?
Okay.
Yeah. Generally the same thing.
Okay.
Thistles, but yeah, there are other uses. There's Paul Stamens has studied the effects of helping colony collapse in bees with some mushroom, with some fungal treatments, and there's a lot of other applications that we're still learning about, like bioremediation and removing oil spills and diesel spills.
That was my next question. I had no idea that was a possibility, but with fungi, right?
Yeah.
It can basically extract oil from a surface or water even, and it basically filters it all out and turns it into a fungus.
Yeah. So there's some studies that were done, several years ago now on test plots where they put diesels down and then, sort of at a control, and one they inoculated with oyster mushrooms, and then they did some other stuff. I don't remember all the details, but essentially after, I think it was 2 years, the oyster mushrooms had pulled all of the spill out and essentially neutralized it and were safe to eat. Were considered safe to eat.
That's insane. That's pretty amazing. I mean, I think that's really what started spurring my interest is when I started seeing all these different articles pop up of what just a plant-based substance, which it's not a plant-based substance, but to me, a dumb guy, it is,
Yeah, a lot of people.
Yeah, it's something that grows out of the ground,
Even like the Denver Botanical Gardens, the fungal collection is in an herbarium, but they're not, they're fungus, they're not herbs. So
sure.
It's still, that's common, the sort of equating them as like a plant, even though they're a completely different kingdom and more closely related to humans than plants are. But it's an easy way to refer to them, as grouping them in with that sort of stuff. So
it's super interesting to me. I'm curious to know how you got started. I know you mentioned you did it with your father.
Yep.
And did you grow up in New Mexico? Or?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Santa Fe.
Okay.
And then moved up to Fort Collins for college and have been there since.
And then did you go to school for biology or mycology? Or
I went to school for natural resource management.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was actually going to go to school for computer science and then switch my degree like 2 weeks before I moved up. I just decided I didn't want to be in a office or whatever doing computer stuff all day and wanted
probably
to
be stuck at a cubicle. I think you made a great choice.
Yeah. I still, kind of have that tech side and
sure
and interest in that, but I'm glad the switch that I made. I don't make nearly as much money as someone in that field would, but it's a little more fulfilling, at least for me.
So did you gain a lot of your knowledge from family members like your dad, or did you self-taught? I mean, how did you get into foraging, learning species of plants and, I mean, just researching information? Or
yeah, so mostly self-taught. Like I said, I started when I was 10, so 20 years ago. I guess I'm 31 now, so 21 years ago.
A bit of time.
But yeah, it became like this sort of, we learned a few species when we went out. And when I was younger, it was just like every year we'd go out a few times and we'd just pick those species we knew. We'd see some other ones. Occasionally some friends that had a little more information would come out and be like, oh, here's this one, this is one that I've heard that is edible, and we would research a little bit. But I didn't really get started in the actual like digging in and learning new stuff until towards the end of my college career. And I think that my studies in natural resource management sort of taught me how to learn this information as well. I learned a ton of trees and those sorts of things while studying for school. And so that interest in like the physiological and the scientific and, taxonomy, that sort of led me down that path of really digging in and learning other species and other edible species and sort of.
Can we dive off into that a little bit? I mean, we dwelled on mushrooms here for a good 30 minutes, which is awesome.
We could do a lot longer too.
Yeah, I'm sure, man. Well, we'll have you back, man, because this is super interesting to me. I think our listeners are going to be super interested in this. But there's a ton of plants that you can eat that are out there in Colorado. I know of a few, just from some guests that I've had in. I don't know if you're familiar with Donnie Dust.
Mm-mm.
Okay, you got to check him out. He's your modern day caveman or paleo man. Like makes his own arrowheads.
Oh, cool.
Forages his own food. I mean, he'll go out for months at a time and just live in a cave with his dog. And he's literally going with pretty much a loincloth in the summer months, and a water bottle, and that's really about it.
That's really cool.
Super rad dude. We did an episode with him, but I kind of learned a lot from him on that episode, like that you could eat thistle, and I knew you could eat dandelion greens and stuff like that. And there's so many plants out there that are edible.
Yeah. Tons, lots of them. And
do you want to name like maybe your top 5 or something of when we start going down berries or wild berries or plants, or what's the best way to kind of cram it all into this hour and a half that we have with you?
Man, we could start with plants. We'll start in like the seasonality. So, spring is sort of like the big plant time because that's when everything is sprouting their new growth. And for greens specifically, that new growth is what you're going to want to forage because it's the most tender and the best tasting. As far as like top 5s, there's so many. Man, I don't know that I could even begin to pick those out.
You don't have to. I was trying to figure out. It's so much information.
In. Yeah. And that sort of is a good way to maybe lead into how I choose to learn more as I'm pursuing this. What I do is I'll choose a couple species that I either learn about from research or reading a book, and I'll try to find those in the wild, or the opposite, I'll find a species that I don't know, and then I'll try to learn the reverse and see if it's edible. So
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's kind of how I choose to learn, and I think with my experience, I can do a ton at a time. I can, be like, okay, here's this one. I'll take some pictures and some samples, and here's another one. And I can do, a bunch of plants and mushrooms at the same time because I've done it for so long. But for beginners, I recommend like pick 1 or 2. Just like, okay, pretty much everyone can identify a dandelion, I think.
Yeah,
but maybe,
maybe
you'll pick like a mustard. There's hundreds of mustard species, and you'll see if you can find one and identify it and figure out, what type it is. And all of the mustards are edible. So that's a good place to start. Some are better than others. The same goes for mushrooms, like, okay, I'm going to learn chanterelles this year. You may never find some, you might take you 3 years to find your first chanterelle, but if you kind of research it,
kind of like elk hunting, huh?
Yeah. Eventually you'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Or the inverse, if you find a plant and you're like, I see that plant all the time. I recognize that leaf shape. I want to learn what that is, take pictures, take a sample home and study it. So that's sort of how I choose to learn when I'm learning new things.
And
then,
just to be clear, or this is a question too, when it comes to berries, there's a lot more poisonous berries out there than there are like mushrooms per se or plants, right?
Mhm.
Like berries are kind of what you got to watch out for. Or
to an extent, we do have some toxic berries. The main one that comes to mind would be baneberry, which is a red berry. Probably our most common toxic berry in Colorado. But there are actually a lot of safe berries too. All of the currants that we have, which are several species, are edible, and they're pretty easy to ID. The raspberries are very easy to ID.
one of my favorites.
Yeah, everyone should know that one. We have,
especially when they're wild.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, that's baneberry there. That's one you definitely don't want to eat. And that's a super common one in Colorado. And again, if you don't know what it is, don't eat it.
Right.
I think, that might be something hard for like a kid to get, but an adult, like,
Sure.
if you don't know what it is, don't put it in your mouth. It's pretty straightforward.
But I would imagine that would get harder the more educated that you get in this, right? Because you're like,
yes,
you're probably excited that you found something, right?
Yeah, there's definitely a complacency that can come with some of it. Like, there's a funny saying that you see on the mushroom hunting world, and there's old mushroom hunters and bold mushroom hunters, but there's no old, bold mushroom hunters. Essentially getting at eventually, the bold ones eat the wrong thing and die.
Right.
But it's really as simple as just, not eating it until you're 100% certain of its identity. And Samuel Thayer, who I mentioned earlier, in one of his books says that he suggests becoming familiar to the point of, if you were in a grocery store and someone was holding a banana and you were, or you were holding a banana and someone was like, that's not a banana, you're like completely confident that person is crazy because, that's a banana that you have. Becoming that familiar with a wild food before you eat it. And I think that can be difficult with some things because there's some ambiguity, especially with mushrooms, but it's a really good way to sort of approach it. And like, you don't need to let your ego get in there. Like, I know what this is, I'm going to eat it. It's fine if you want to take a year to figure out a plant before you eat it. I've skipped eating mushrooms that I was sure of for a few years before I tried them, even though I was sure of what it was, just because I was uncomfortable with it. That's totally okay to do. So,
and then my next question is, how do you forage responsibly? Because there's a lot of different opinions out there. But when you come across a plant or a root or something like that, obviously if you take the root, that thing is done, right? Mm-hmm. But when it comes to mushrooms, do you take the entire patch, or how does that kind of work when it comes to berries, mushrooms, plants? What's kind of your rules of thumb?
Everyone will have their own sort of ways they approach this, but the general rule that you'll see online is don't take more than a certain percentage. Sometimes people say 10% or 20% or up to 50%. For mushrooms, there have been several studies, long-running studies, that show that it doesn't matter if you take all of the fruiting body or half of it. The mushrooms don't care, because the mycelium under the ground is the actual body, and this is just the fruit. So there's been lots of studies, and it's still very hotly debated online. But for mushrooms, you're safe to take the entire fruiting body as long as you do it, respectfully. For plants, it gets a little more complicated. So the nice thing about a lot of the plants that I forage is they're not native. A lot of them are either invasive or have just been introduced and sort of naturalized. And those you shouldn't feel bad about removing, because they're actually damaging.
They're killing what's natural,
the native plants. Roots will, obviously, if you harvest a root, you're destroying the plant. Shoots, you can take a certain percentage of, usually no more than half, before you're going to damage the plant. And then berries, you're fine to take any number of, they do provide seeds for future generations of that plant, so it's nice to leave some, and also wildlife rely on them. So leaving some behind is good, but the wildlife is always going to be out there eating them. So you're never going to like outpick a bear or a squirrel. You know, they live out there. They're eating those things all the time.
Yeah, and that is one thing to be cautious of when you're picking berries. I just know from like some of my childhood, I had an uncle that lived in northern Montana, so I would spend some summers up there, and we would go pick huckleberries. But bears love berries, man.
Oh yeah.
So we wear bells on our shoes and all kinds of stuff, and it didn't always work, man.
I regularly see people who are out foraging and running into bears and eating choke cherries and
kind of eat the same sort of stuff, right? Like
it's interesting, but that's sort of my approach. And then to touch on the sort of non-native thing again, because I think it's really interesting. A lot of these plants that I'm foraging were actually brought here as food plants.
Really?
So the Europeans brought them with them as either medicine or food and planted them in their gardens or their settlements. And then those plants sort of spread and became naturalized. And there's some really interesting ones that can be found in Colorado. One of them is rhubarb.
So that's not a natural or a native plant to Colorado then, huh?
Yeah, people will find rhubarb, randomly in the woods. It's common to like grow for just in gardens and stuff, but people will find it, and often it's where old mining cabins were, because people would plant it in their gardens and and have it as a food source while they were out doing the work up in the mountains or mining or settling. And there's some other ones that are pretty interesting too. Asparagus, wild asparagus, is one that was brought from...
I think I saw a photo of you on your Instagram, and you were holding a piece of asparagus that looked like this microphone boom, man. It was huge.
Yeah. It was
that's just straight up asparagus? Or is that, okay, I was curious about that.
It's technically, there it is right there.
That's awesome.
In my top 9 from last year.
Damn, that thing is huge, man.
Yeah, I was laughing because my top 3 pictures were of me, and I'm usually doing my own photography, but my wife took 2 of those, and one of my buddies took the other one. I was just like, I guess I need to get somebody to take more pictures of me because those ones do the best.
Right.
They're usually because I'm holding something impressive, I guess.
Yeah. That is one big ass asparagus.
Asparagus is really cool, and that's something that pretty much everyone can identify because we see it in stores all the time.
Sure.
But it's generally referred to as wild asparagus, but it's actually feral. So it escaped from cultivation. It was brought here as a food plant. And usually it's birds that will plant it in the wild. They eat the berries off of it. Mm-hmm. And then, they're sitting on fences and they pass through and then they get planted and then you get a patch of feral asparagus. It's escaped. Mm. And I have a little piece that I wrote on it on my website, but if people want to learn more about it. But yeah, it's like you can go out in the spring and pick pounds of asparagus, and it's way better than the stuff you get in the store.
Oh, hell yeah. I know just for a fact, I started going to farmers markets maybe like 15, 20 years ago, mm-hmm. and talking to people that were growing their own food to bring to market, right? The small batch farmers, basically, is what I would call them.
Yeah.
And I just noticed the difference between going to the grocery store, right? You buy something, you bring it home, 2-3 days max is what you got. The stuff I would get from the farmer's market would last weeks or even months, right? Because there's not all that lag time of it being shipped around and sprayed with different things or whatever it is.
It's
stored.
Fresh. Fresh picked.
It's fresh, and it makes a difference too in how you feel. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why I'm so big on eating wild game too. Like meat is a huge part of my diet, and unfortunately, it's not elk this year.
Oh, I was lucky this year.
Yeah, I struck out, man.
I got my first with a bow. Year.
Congratulations,
Thank
man.
You.
And I got to say one thing too. One of the posts that I saw, I'm really big about this, and I think the way that you posted that and showed your harvest was very ethical. Mm-hmm. And I wish more I don't knock any hunters that are trophy hunters, but I wish more hunters would do that, because I think it would give us a better rap as hunters. And I just loved your taste and the way that you took those photos to, you're still proud of it, but you don't have to hold up this bloody face to prove something,
Yeah. I want to be, careful with sharing some of that stuff, because, my Forage page, it's really for foraging, but wild foods is sort of it's sort of all encompassing for me. Like I treat hunting and fishing as I do foraging. But I know that some of my followers are a little bit sensitive to the hunting side. You know, I have vegans that follow me and plenty of vegetarians, and they're not super interested in it.
But I think it was very tasteful the way that you did it.
Yeah. So
did you get some hate over it?
No, I didn't. I didn't at all.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So I still want to present that information in a way that, you know, people can understand and people can get, you know, like most of my meat comes from stuff that I harvest. We will occasionally, you know, buy a little bit of beef or chicken, that sort of thing. But most of the meat that we eat is from stuff that I've gotten through hunting and fishing. And this is the post here. If you're watching.
That's my whole thing with it is I like to know where it came from. Like if you go down to the local butcher shop and see how stuff is processed, and then you go one step further and go to the meat market, it's way different. Yeah, it is way different than what I'm doing out there. So.
Totally, and that's something that I talk to people about, you know, who are curious about hunting or, you know, want to know sort of more about it, and that's sort of that connection between where your food comes from and the process of turning an animal into food is something that I think anyone who eats meat should experience.
Yeah,
I just think
100%.
it's surreal. It's emotional. It's super, super important.
I beat this up on here all the time, but I think it puts life in perspective a little bit too. Mm-hmm. It puts a value on a life, whether it's an animal or a human. When you pull that trigger or pull that release or however that goes down, it really is, there's this overwhelming, or for me, I'm speaking personally, there's this overwhelming feeling of adrenaline, sorrow, sadness, happiness, accomplishment, all happens at once.
Yeah.
And then every time you put it on your plate, that runs back through my mind sometimes, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. This year when I shot my elk, I sort of shut down for a little while. It was just the adrenaline dump and the emotions. And it was just you know, more than a year of practice and getting the bow ready and shooting and tuning and building arrows and hiking our butts off. And
yeah, man, it's a lot of work. People don't realize how much work it is until they've experienced it firsthand.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I mean, still thinking back on it, I sort of get just shocked because of the whole experience. But you know, I would also be lying if I said it wasn't fun. You know, it's fun to be out there and do this, but that sort of emotional connection to your food is what really is fulfilling for me. You know, that I worked hard for this and now I can feed myself and my friends and family, you know, this wild stuff that I worked really hard for. And I agree. It's cool.
That's awesome.
I think more people would, you know, I'm not saying everyone should go hunt because just isn't sustainable.
Yeah. To each his own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, you know, if people could at least experience it and, you know, sort of understand where hunters are coming from and that side of it, I think it would be really good for everyone.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that responsibility lies on the hunters too. The way that you portray yourself, you know what I mean?
And
there's that's what I was complimenting you on is I thought it was really tasteful the way that you showed it. Which is still raising awareness about hey, this is something that can happen, and technically it needs to happen.
Mm-hmm. I wrote a pretty long little thing on that, and you know, I'll share the typical trophy shots, you know, of me with the animal on my personal page. But you know, for my followers who are interested in foraging stuff, I think it's important to share the information about hunting and fishing and other wild foods in a way that they can sort of connect with. And so that's what I tried to do with some of those posts. And I don't do them that often, but I think, you know, it's something that I'm interested in. And I had posted every day.
It gave you some credibility with me because I was like, okay, this guy's probably just straight vegan, hippie dude, you know, but you're totally not. No. So and I'm not putting anybody I love hippies, man. But it really it's 360 degrees of foraging. You're talking about meat, fish, even poultry. You know,
birds, plants, mushrooms. It's sort of, and the other reason that I shared that was because last year I challenged myself to post once a day. I started in like the beginning of April, and I posted at least once a day on my Instagram until I went on that elk hunt. And that was sort of like, okay, everyone, like I'm going to be taking a break because I'm elk hunting. If you want to like hear about the hunt when I'm done, I'll share a little bit. And I had some interest in it.
So good for that disconnect too, man.
Oh,
I
yeah.
encourage anybody to do that. Even if you're not hunting, just go take some time off.
Yeah.
Go where there's no cell phone reception. Go with some family and friends, or go by yourself. You know, if you go by yourself, make sure you've checked in with somebody. But
Totally.
you do a lot of thinking out there. You know,
Oh, yeah.
You come back a different person. You've come back, or I have always come back, and I feel like I've got a lot of problems solved while I'm out there. Like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to attack that? What do I need to do better? You know, in my life, it's crazy, man. It gets very spiritual for me, but
Yeah, me too.
But yeah, I encourage anybody just to go out and spend. You don't have to go out and hunt, but yeah, spend some time out there.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sorry, we dove off on that because that's something that I'm passionate about. And congratulations,
Thank
man.
you.
That's a feat. I know what work goes into that. You know, I want to go back to regions a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Your website is Forage, Colorado.
Yep.
We have listeners mainly in the U.S., but across the U.S. Like, we get to see those demographics, which is really cool.
Yeah.
We have listeners outside of the U.S. We got them in every major continent, which is awesome.
That's super cool.
Yeah. If somebody's listening to this right now and they don't live in Colorado, does this information translate to other regions? And what are some things that people could do locally to kind of find, you know, like a Facebook page or something that has foraging information?
Yeah. So the reason that, you know, I went with the Forage Colorado name is because I had this mushroom interest that I wanted to sort of create a group to share information with. And I was brainstorming names, and one of my buddies was just like, how about Forage Colorado? So that sort of just like stuck, and it's become, you know, the brand. But I do struggle with it sometimes because I have people from outside of Colorado that tune into my stuff and check out what I'm doing. And I also do stuff outside of Colorado. But, you know, I think with what it is, it's just, you know, that's what I have now. And
it's cool, man. I just wanted to explain that this does translate outside of Colorado.
Definitely.
And because the podcast is here in Colorado, we get very local with it, you know,
Totally.
like, so we get stuck in that Colorado bubble too. So I know the struggles that you have, and then people will hit you up and like, hey, you know, like,
but all of this stuff, you know, there is regionality to all of it. But as we touched on earlier, a lot of these species spread, you know, either all over North America or all over the world even. I was in Ireland in 2019 for my honeymoon. I got married, and I was seeing plants that were either the same species or very similar species to stuff that I forage here. So, you know, it's definitely not bound by state lines. This stuff spreads all over the place, and we have species that other places don't have, but they might have a similar species. So I focused regionally because that's sort of what I've created my brand to do, but the information definitely translates to wherever anyone is tuning in from, you know, whether it's the exact same species that are edible in your area or something very close. So it definitely translates.
And can you give some tips to our listeners if they're interested in this and they want to get started in foraging? Like, what are some of the basic things that you should be carrying with you out there to find stuff?
Yeah.
Is there some sort of like dictionary that shows you different plant species? You know, like what are the things that you need to really get started?
Yeah. So at a minimum, you know, if you're going to go out in the wild, you probably want like the general, like going out into the wild stuff, quote unquote, you know, some water and
a Cafaro backpack.
A Cafaro backpack. And
shout out to Cafaro. You're blasting them. You're not sponsored by them, but you got their stuff all over your website.
Oh yeah.
I thought you were, man, but Cafaro, if you're listening to this, you should sponsor Orion if you haven't already.
Yeah, Aaron.
Yeah.
I've chatted with Aaron before a little bit.
Yeah. Cool guy.
Yeah, great guy. Yeah, I just love Cafaro's stuff, so I use it, and
they make a quality product.
Photographs
for sure.
well, and it lasts forever and ever. And I beat it up pretty regularly, so It's great stuff for sure. And made right here in Colorado.
Yeah, even better, right?
Yeah. So stuff to get started. There's no one book to rule them all, so to say, for foraging. It can depend on your region. It can depend on what you're interested in learning. I mentioned Samuel Thayer earlier. He's always what I recommend starting with if people are looking at plants in North America. He has 3 books, and as I mentioned, they're my favorite by far. The way he presents the information is just, it makes it really easy to learn. He's got good stories and
a lot of illustrations in there for guys like me.
Yep.
Okay,
really
cool.
good ways to sort of like what to look for, and it's not too overwhelming. There is some botanical jargon, you get into like the physiology and botanical terms, but he makes it easy to sort of digest and become comfortable with. And he has some really great like how to get started, and as I mentioned, the being 100% certain, and he uses a term called a search image, which is something that I've started adopting in some of my classes. And what that is essentially just getting your brain and eyes used to finding the patterns of a plant or mushroom that you're looking for. And so over repeated instances of being introduced to that pattern, you'll start to recognize it and pick it out of, the mess of other plants or mushrooms that you're seeing. And this is something that comes up especially with morels, because they sort of blend in really well. And we can talk about morels in a little bit if you want to,
Okay.
but I just caught that out of the corner of my eye. And, it's a good way, the more that you get used to seeing a morel, the better you're going to be at finding a morel. And the same goes for plants, different plant leaf shapes that are slightly different than a similar plant.
Makes you look at the world a little bit different.
It does.
Huh?
Yeah.
You start noticing a lot more, I would imagine.
So as far as books, that would be my recommendation to start with for plants. But in your region, there's always, going to be something available. In Colorado, we have some great authors. Brianna Wiles in southwestern Colorado has some good books. Thomas Elpel has a book in Colorado, and these are all going to be on my resource page. I need to add them in. But and then also Bob Seebeck is another one in Colorado that we have, who's a knowledgeable forager that's got some good content book-wise. And then as far as mushrooms go, that one is a little harder to get on the education side, of edibility. The good books we have in Colorado more focus on the mycological study side, but they can still help you learn, and then you can get online and sort of learn the edible ones. We have Colorado, let's see, there's Rocky Mountain mushrooms by Habitat, and there's mushrooms of the Rocky Mountain region, I believe. Those are the 2 that I would recommend in Colorado for mushrooms. And then online, if you're in Colorado, the Colorado Mycological Society has a really great Facebook page if you're on Facebook. There's my page, Forage Colorado. There is a group that I started last year called Rocky Mountain Foragers, which sort of wants to incorporate the foraging side and, maybe focus on, there's not a ton of plant foraging groups on Facebook. There are some, but not regionally specific. So I started that group that's slowly growing. So really, wherever you are, there's information to be had. You just gotta.
And then beyond the information, kind of going back to it, like what are you carrying in your pack? I mean, do you need a knife? Do you need some sort of bag? How are you storing this stuff so it doesn't spoil? That sort of thing. Yeah.
So right, we did start talking about that. Aside from the general like day use stuff, you're gonna want some sort of cutting tool. I usually will carry at least a pocket knife with me. If you're going to be...
It's good to have with you anyways if you're out there. You never know,
totally.
It could come in handy.
Yeah, it's always good to have
things.
one. If you're going to be doing some plant harvesting, a little pair of snips or scissors can be useful, especially if you're doing something like stinging nettles, which are a great edible, but they will sting you pretty good if you pick them barehanded. And then like something to put your harvest into. I like to use mesh bags or paper bags. People will use baskets. Those are great for mushrooms. And then that's really...
Is that something that you're sliding in your pack, or you're
carrying
a Trader Joe's bag through the forest?
I'll do both.
Okay.
I'll usually take like a mesh or like a cloth grocery bag with me if I get a ton of stuff just in my bag. But usually I'm just putting my harvest into my backpack, so I don't have to like have stuff in my hands. It's also a little more inconspicuous.
Sure.
Sometimes I like to be like the stealth forager. just look like a dude in the woods and not a mushroom picker.
And then obviously education's a big part of it, but what are some other best practices that we may have not discussed, getting into this?
Yeah, so a question that I get a ton, and I imagine some people probably have thought of already, is sort of the legality side of like where to forage. And this is one that can be a little difficult. The thing that I always recommend is if you have an area that you're thinking about, just call the local land manager. So if it's, National Forest, you would call your district ranger office and ask. Generally, National Forest and BLM are good to go for personal use foraging. Some places require, either a free or very cheap permit to pick mushrooms and berries.
Oh, really? In the state of Colorado?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And as far as
so how would you obtain that?
You just call the office, and then either they can do it online or you have to go in and get one.
Okay.
Colorado is a little bit behind in terms of the foraging.
Are there seasons on it?
Regulations.
I'm sorry to.
No, you're good.
Okay.
The seasons aren't restricted like a hunting season or anything.
Sure.
In some states they are, but in Colorado we don't have a huge like regulations and laws and stuff about foraging. It's just not there. Like Oregon, they've got some pretty good laws about mushroom picking and commercial picking and permitting and different forests and stuff. But here it's pretty gray area often.
Okay.
Typically state lands are not allowed. Like open spaces and natural areas, you're not typically allowed to harvest anything.
Okay.
And then like parks and stuff can be hit or miss. So usually I just recommend calling up if you're not sure. A lot of people, I'm not condoning this, but a lot of people just do it anyways. And,
Right.
you're picking stuff that's not going to harm anything as long as you're not, you're doing it conscientiously and you're not like trampling through and destroying stuff. And
sure. You're not selling it on the side of the road on your fruit cart.
Picking some invasive weeds and mushrooms that are going to, aren't the fruit essentially of the fungal body. It's not doing any harm. So some people I know don't really even bother. But
so once you get your harvest, say morel season comes in, right?
Mm-hmm.
You go and you pick a bunch of morels. How are you preserving those to use them, in February or is there any way to do that?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
A ton of different ways to do it. And it can depend on the species. I do a lot of dehydrating of mushrooms in particular. They're really easy to store that way. But I also will dry saute them and then freeze them cooked. And then I can just sort of pull them out and use them however I want. Things can be fermented and stored for a long time. Mushroom fermentation is a little bit more finicky. It's doable, but it just takes a little bit more of a, you have to add essentially a culture to ferment them. They don't have like a natural culture on them that'll do the fermentation.
And then as far as berries, plants, obviously you can't really store those too well. I mean, it's not, maybe rhubarb or something that's like that.
Plants
texture
could be like blanched and frozen, or they can be, fermented or pickled and jarred.
Mm-hmm.
Berries again can be frozen, but it's
you better be making a pie when you unfreeze them, right?
You can make jellies and jams with them.
Right.
I froze a lot of berries, a lot of cherries this summer to make wine with, and that's a good way to store that sort of fruit. But if I'm out,
how good does the wine taste? I should have asked you to bring some.
We still have like a month and some to go on the fermentation.
Oh, shit.
So
yeah.
I'll have to bring some next time. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll do that.
We just
we'll
started
get wasted. We'll get cherry choke wasted.
Exactly. We just started it, so it's got some time to go still. But really, freezing and dehydrating are going to be the main two. They're just the easiest to store stuff.
And then the dehydrating process, are you doing that in an oven or is that a specific dehydrator?
Yeah, I have an Excalibur dehydrator, like one of the big ones, just because I do a lot of it. But you can do it in an oven, just lowest setting, slice your stuff thin if it's sliceable, and just let it go until it's crispy dry. And then I vac seal with a little desiccant packet, so it just stays completely good. But you can just put it in a jar and seal it up. It's good to go.
And then, is there information out there on how to date that stuff so you're not eating it, 2 years old, 3 years old? I mean, is there some rules?
I would just put the name and date on it. But honestly, if you dehydrate it and package it correctly, it's kind of indefinite. Like, I've got some mushrooms from 2014 that I've dehydrated that I'm just waiting to use for something.
Right. And then, one thing that I like about your site and your Instagram page is you kind of show the food prepared too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and you'll go into some details on that. So it's kind of really from you picking it to the plate.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that's sort of talking to other foragers and even getting into foraging, over the past 20 years, the connection between picking something or learning something, picking it, and then turning it into food is something that a lot of people struggle with. And including myself, it's sort of like, you can pick some raspberries on the trail and eat them, and, that's exciting. They're wild raspberries.
Tastes good.
But going that one step further and picking enough to make like a batch of raspberry jam or something, that's sort of the connection that a lot of people struggle with. And I like to share that to sort of inspire people to do.
It definitely inspired me, and I think you should go down that path even more, man. Like, I see the Orion cooking show or something, man.
Yeah.
Like, or Forage, Colorado, where you're actually preparing a meal with elk or trout or something like that, and then your, natural spices. You got your asparagus, whatever. I think that would be awesome, man. I would tune into that. Yeah.
I have
I'm already tuned into your page because of that element. Like, you're showing, I think that's an omelet that you got there, or I've seen some where you make like an omelet with wild forage plants or something like that. So.
That's wild kimchi and elk bulgogi, a Korean dish that I made for a BHA, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers.
Oh, yeah. Great organization, too, by the way.
Yeah, we did some really cool stuff with them later last year. But yeah, the food side, you bring that up, and it's sort of, it feeds into some ideas that I've been mulling over for a while that we may see. I don't want to say anything yet, but you may see. Just watch out for it this year. I might have some stuff in the works. So.
Awesome, man. Well, we'll look forward to it, and before you launch it, come back and let us know about it so we can let our listeners know, and
definitely.
We'll help grow it for you,
Heck yeah.
So who all comes to you to learn? I mean, do you have kids classes? This is something that you can do as a family, really.
You can, yeah. And a lot of people do. My very first class was a class for morels, black morels, up in Fort Collins area. And I didn't know what I was doing. I had like 15 people come out, and I was sort of overwhelmed. But, we all went out and had a good time and found morels. And
hey,
yeah,
that's all you need to do.
That's sort of how it got started. And now it's, all walks of life are interested. And I get way more requests for classes than I could ever fulfill with my schedule right now. I wish that I had the freedom to just take a class whenever I wanted to and teach it. But, full-time job, married life, other personal stuff that I like to do.
You got kids?
No kids.
Wait till you have kids.
No kids yet.
Yeah, that's a whole nother ballgame.
But I keep myself pretty busy, and, I just fit in classes when I can. But yeah, really anyone. I get families. I get just groups of, like, last year I taught a class to just like a group of people up in Idaho Springs. Just like someone reached out and was like, "Hey, I'm going to hire this guy who wants to take a class." And
nice.
So I just went up and did a class. I really like to do classes on people's private property. One, because the permitting side is non-existent there, because I can just teach a class on someone's property without having to worry about it.
Sure.
And also it sort of like shows people that there's food in their yard that they can just go out and eat.
Right.
And that's something I also want to try to incorporate into my classes this year, is offering some like quick, I'll come over and show you what you can eat in your backyard type stuff. Because I think a lot of people, it can sort of get that.
It makes it so easy too. Like, literally walk out in your backyard and find something that you can eat. Right.
Yeah. So I'm trying to work in, I had some plans last year, but, COVID sort of made that a little difficult to do in-person stuff. And,
Yeah.
I still was able to do a few, but
What all do you offer at Forage, Colorado, as far as classes? So for people that are listening and haven't checked out your website yet or anything, you can find all your information on it's foragecolorado.com, right?
Yep.
Okay. But explain to our listeners real quick what you offer. I know you offer wild mushroom hunting, plant foraging, that sort of thing. But
so right now I'm actually working on an update for my class page. I like to update it once a year and just sort of give anyone who's checking in some new information. But essentially I offer customized foraging classes. So I like to do small groups because then I'm able to really get personal with the information and sort of explain it in a way that I like to explain. When you get like a big group of people, it's hard to get everyone the information that they want. You have people asking questions about this and people wanting to know about this, and you can't really like focus on the topic at hand. So I like to do small group classes, 1 to 5-ish people. And then as far as class type, it's really whatever they want to learn. If they just want to have me out to their house for an hour and want me to look at all their garden weeds and tell them what they can eat, I'm down to do that. If they want to go on an 8-hour hike and see everything they could possibly eat, that we come across, I do that too. So it's really very customizable to what the people want to learn that I'm teaching. And, I definitely wouldn't claim to know everything we might come across, but
if somebody's not in Colorado, do you do online classes? Do you do any like one-on-one FaceTimes or Zooms or anything like that?
I haven't started doing that. But I've entertained the idea of doing some virtual stuff, especially, with the COVID stuff going on. I did some webinars and podcasts and more of that in 2020. And I really enjoyed, that medium.
I think people could really take advantage of it now too, because they have extra time or they're working from home, or maybe they're on their afternoon walk every day and they're not in an office, so.
Yeah. I mean, if there's an interest in it, I would definitely offer it, if someone wanted to just get on and ask questions.
And what's the best way to reach you? Through the website? If somebody has a question or something?
Just there's a contact page on the website.
Perfect.
And I'm pretty responsive through that. I think every once in a while I'll miss an email, but I usually get back to pretty much everyone. If you have a class idea or you just have a question, feel free to reach out. I'm always saying, like, people are a little bit bashful about wanting to reach out, but I love talking about this stuff. So I'm like, if you find a mushroom that you want to know, take some good pictures and send them to me, because I like learning too and helping. And that's just like, until I get overwhelmed with it, I'm just going to keep asking, telling people to send me stuff if they want to.
Great.
So.
And I think that anybody that listens to this or has listened to this podcast on a regular basis, I'm really big on supporting guide services, supporting, fly guides, elk hunting guides, outfitters, because you're going to learn so much more. Like, go with an expert. Yeah. They're going to teach you the rules. And then in a couple years or a year or after that first class, you decide when you're comfortable to go do it on your own. But then you have this basis or a foundation that you can build off of.
Right.
You know what I mean? And then you start using your own experience. So I highly encourage you guys, if you're getting into foraging, to check out somebody like Forage Colorado and spend a little bit of money, man. You're going to save a ton of time and a ton of headache by doing that.
It's nice. I even, when I have the opportunity to take a class, from someone who knows more, knows different stuff, I definitely do, just because of what you said. It's, I might know half of the stuff they teach, but there's always something new that they know that they can teach me. And it's way faster to learn it like that. And it's just, being a person who's mostly self-taught, it's definitely a lot faster to learn it from someone, as a teacher or a guide. It's a really great way to jumpstart into the hobby. But that said, don't be afraid to get started on your own.
Don't be afraid to ask either.
Yeah. Reach out, to me or to a group or whoever, and just get started, jump in. Even if you're learning one plant a year or one mushroom a year, you're still learning and you're still sort of progressing in this. It's not something that you're going to pick up overnight and be an expert in,
Yeah.
People often call me an expert, but I don't even call myself an expert. I think it's something that you always can learn more. So.
Well said. my next question for you, and we're coming up on time here. It's flown by, man.
Yeah.
I feel like I could do 6 hours with you, which is awesome. You spend, with your job and what you do, you spend a ton of time outdoors in the backcountry, and you're noticing a lot more than the average person because of what you're looking for, right? Like you're basically looking at every nook and cranny.
Yeah.
With the influx in Colorado and the Rocky Mountain regions in general, I'm not just specifically talking about Colorado. It's everywhere right now. People are moving to more rural places, and a lot of them are moving into mountain communities. With the influx, what are some things that you notice that people could be doing better, that you run across on a common basis that irks you?
Man, probably picking up trash would be the main one. I just, running into a pile of trash out in the wild is always something that's just like, man, that's a bummer.
Yeah.
Respecting the environment is so important to me. And the stuff that I do, and whether it's hunting, if you're just a hunter, you get this connection to nature and to the wild that you don't get from just going on a hike and, summiting a 14er, which is something that I have never done. But I don't think you get the same connection as you do from actually learning a plant or a mushroom or an animal to the point of eating it. There's just this like almost ancestral connection that you get to the land by doing that stuff. And I think more people could benefit from treating the land that way, in that, this is not just a place to recreate and hike around and live in and enjoy the scenery. It's something that, is living and producing and can provide for you if you want it to. And just being more respectful in general of that.
It's really well said, man. I couldn't agree with you more. And I love your outtake on it. I love what you're doing. Before we jump off here, what's next for Forage Colorado? Do you have anything coming up, any classes or anything, super recent?
Yeah, I don't have any pre-planned classes. Like I mentioned, I'm sort of just doing like the one-off private classes when I can into my schedule. I get people reaching out pretty regularly. I'll start scheduling those late winter, early spring as I have time. I don't like plan ahead or take money ahead just because it's hard to plan my schedule out that far in advance.
Sure.
I have some ideas that I'm working on for, broader class options that I can sort of provide regularly, like once a week or twice a month or something, where I can take a small group out on like a plant walk or a tree walk. I'm obviously working for the State Forest Service. I know my trees pretty well and studying natural resource management. And I always get tree related questions, and trees are actually really important for foraging and specifically mushroom hunting. Knowing your trees can really help you learn the mushrooms and how to find them and which species they are. But I have some ideas on offering some of those classes where we aren't actually like collecting stuff, but we're out, here's this,
Just
here's your identify.
stuff,
yeah, like a plant walk.
Identifying.
And then, as I mentioned, the smaller kind of hour in your backyard type classes. This is all just stuff that I've been brainstorming and wanted to kind of
awesome. So just reach out to Forage Colorado if this is something that you're interested in.
Yeah.
It sounds like you kind of mold it to whatever specific needs
I do, and
somebody wants to learn.
It's
right?
nice
and that's cool
that I have the freedom to do that, and
yeah,
a full-time job that kind of can let me be flexible in my free time. And I might, we sort of hinted at it. I'm working on maybe starting some video stuff, so
awesome,
you might
man.
see that sometime this year.
Well, we're a big fan of you, man. I appreciate you taking some time out of your schedule and getting off of work early to come down and talk to us, man.
Thank you for having me.
That's awesome. Before we jump off here, where can people find you? We know foragecolorado.com. But you have an Instagram page. Let's drop that. If you're on Twitter, any of those other platforms.
Yeah. Facebook, Forage Colorado. And then, as I mentioned, Rocky Mountain Foragers, if you want more of like a community setting, I manage that. And then on Instagram, which is my most active, is at Forage Colorado. And then, like I said, if you want to reach out any of those outlets, I'm pretty responsive to.
Go give Forage Colorado a follow on Instagram. You will not be disappointed.
Yeah, I'm almost
good information.
I'm almost to 3,000, so I'll have to do something at 3,000.
Awesome, man.
Give away something or.
Yeah. Give away some choke cherry wine.
Yeah. Give away a class or something.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Well, thank you again so much for your time. Anna, how are we doing back there? You doing okay?
We are all cleared up back here, Bobby.
All right. Thank you so much for your help, Anna. Thank you. I really appreciate you coming in, Orion.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Bobby.
I can't wait to sit down with you again, man.
Yeah, let's do it again, definitely.
Everybody, take it easy.